You should be careful who you call invisible, because sometimes the person you ignore is the one who sees everything. The words hung in the air of the elegant Manhattan restaurant long before anyone understood their meaning. The evening had started like any other night at the Whitmore House, one of New York City's most exclusive dining rooms, where polished marble floors reflected golden lights and every table carried the quiet sound of wealth, ambition, and influence. At the center of it all was Richard Whitmore, a billionaire real estate investor known for his expensive suits, powerful connections, and the confidence of a man who believed every door in the world would open for him. Across the room moved Ava Mitchell, a black waitress who had spent years learning that dignity was not something given by others. It was something you carried within yourself. She walked between tables with a calm professionalism, balancing orders, remembering details, and treating every guest with the same respect, whether they arrived in designer clothing or simple jackets. To most people in that restaurant, Ava was just another employee wearing a name tag. They saw the uniform before they saw the person. But they did not know the strength behind her quiet expression. They did not know how many times she had entered rooms where people underestimated her, and how many times she had chosen grace instead of anger. That night, Richard Whitmore sat with business partners discussing million-dollar deals and international investments. The people around him laughed at his jokes, agreed with his opinions, and carefully followed his mood. Power surrounded him so completely that he had started believing he could never be challenged. When Ava approached his table with his order, she noticed a small mistake had been made. The wrong side dish had been placed beside his meal. It was a simple error, the kind that could happen in any busy restaurant. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore," Ava said politely. "I'll have that corrected right away." But Richard did not see a person trying to fix a mistake. He saw someone he believed had less importance than him. His expression changed. His voice lowered as he spoke to his guests in Korean, assuming the language would hide his words from everyone nearby. He smiled slightly, confident that nobody understood. He believed Ava would never know what he had said. He believed nobody in that room would notice. But someone did. Near the entrance of the restaurant, a man in a dark tailored suit had just arrived. Daniel Kang had been quietly watching the room, not because he wanted attention, but because he had learned that the smallest details often revealed the truth about people. He heard every word Richard said, every insult, every assumption, every moment of disrespect hidden behind a language Richard thought was a shield. Daniel did not react immediately. He simply stood there, silent, his eyes fixed on the man who had no idea whose dignity he had just questioned. Because Richard Whitmore thought he was speaking to someone powerless. He thought Ava Mitchell was just a waitress. He had no idea that the woman he dismissed was the most important person in the room to someone who understood exactly what those words meant. And he had no idea that the person who heard everything was the one man who would never forget it. Ava Mitchell had learned something important long before she ever stepped into the Whitmore house. A person could walk into a room wearing a simple uniform and still carry a story far greater than anyone could see. Every morning, before the city awakened and before the first customers arrived, Ava would stand in front of her small apartment window overlooking the quiet streets of Brooklyn and remind herself of one thing. Her worth was never decided by someone else's opinion. She had spent years building a life based on patience, discipline, and kindness. Working as a waitress at a luxury restaurant was not the end of her journey. It was simply one chapter in a much larger story. Ava had once dreamed of becoming a chef, creating meals that brought people together. She loved the way food could cross boundaries, the way a simple dinner could make strangers feel connected. But life had taken unexpected turns, and for now, she worked long hours serving others while quietly preparing for the future she still believed was possible. Her coworkers knew her as the person who stayed calm during the busiest nights, the one who remembered a customer's favorite drink, and the one who helped new employees learn the restaurant without making them feel embarrassed. But outside of work, Ava was much more than the person people saw carrying plates between tables. She was a woman who had survived disappointment, faced unfair assumptions, and still chose compassion. That was the part many people never noticed. They noticed her position, but they missed her character. They noticed her appearance, but they ignored her strength. On that evening at the Whitmore house, Ava had no idea that one conversation would reveal the difference between how people saw her and who she truly was. After Richard Whitmore made his careless remarks, Ava continued doing her job with the same professionalism she had shown all night. She did not give him the reaction he expected. She simply took a quiet breath, looked at the table, and made sure his order would be corrected. But inside, she felt the familiar weight of being judged before being understood. It was not the first time someone had underestimated her. She had experienced moments when people assumed they knew her story before hearing her voice. Yet each time, she reminded herself that other people's ignorance did not define her identity. Across the restaurant, Daniel Kong continued watching silently. Unlike Richard, Daniel understood that a person's true nature was revealed by how they treated those they believed had less power. He had built his own reputation by studying people, by listening carefully, and by noticing what others ignored. Daniel was not impressed by expensive watches, luxury cars, or famous names. He had met many powerful people throughout his life, and he knew that real influence was measured by character, not attention. As Ava walked away from Richard's table, Daniel noticed the small details others missed. The way she kept her composure. The way she refused to let disrespect change who she was. The way she carried herself with quiet confidence even when someone tried to make her feel smaller. He knew then that Richard Whitmore had made a mistake far greater than he understood. He had mistaken kindness for weakness. He had mistaken silence for surrender. And most importantly, he had mistaken Ava Mitchell for someone who did not matter. But Daniel knew the truth. Sometimes the people who stand quietly in the background are the ones with the strongest stories. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the person everyone will remember. And as the evening continued inside the glowing halls of the Whitmore house, Daniel made a decision. He would not allow Ava's dignity to be ignored. Not because she needed someone to save her, but because everyone deserved to be treated with respect. And Richard Whitmore was about to learn that wealth could open many doors, but it could never hide the truth forever. Richard Whitmore had spent decades building an image that made people believe he was untouchable. To the outside world, he was the definition of success. His name appeared on the front pages of business magazines, his company owned some of the most valuable properties in the country, and his presence alone could change the atmosphere of any room he entered. People listened when he spoke. People adjusted their plans when he made decisions. And over time, Richard began to confuse respect with fear, admiration with obedience, and wealth with importance. He grew up believing that winning was everything. From his earliest business days, he learned how to negotiate, how to compete, and how to stay ahead of everyone around him. He was intelligent, ambitious, and determined. Those qualities helped him build an empire. But somewhere along the way, something changed. The success that once came from hard work slowly became a shield that protected his worst habits. He stopped seeing people as individuals and started seeing them as positions. Investors, employees, servers, assistants, people who either helped his goals or stood in his way. Inside the Whitmore house, this attitude followed him everywhere. Employees knew his reputation. Some admired his achievements. Others quietly noticed the way he treated people when he believed nobody important was watching. Richard always knew how to smile for cameras and shake hands at important events, but behind closed doors, his patience disappeared quickly when things did not go according to his expectations. That evening, surrounded by expensive furniture, carefully prepared meals, and influential guests, Richard felt completely in control. He sat at the center of attention, discussing a new property development project worth hundreds of millions of dollars. His business partners nodded along, impressed by his confidence. They saw the billionaire who built a successful company. They did not see the man who believed his status gave him permission to look down on others. When Ava approached his table, Richard barely looked at her as a person. In his mind, she was simply part of the restaurant environment, another employee meant to make his evening comfortable. He never considered that she had dreams, experiences, and a life beyond the dining room. He never considered that the same woman he ignored had faced challenges that required more strength than any business negotiation he had ever completed. But that was Richard's greatest weakness. He judged people by what they could do for him, not by who they truly were. After Ava walked away from the table, Richard continued his conversation, completely unaware that the room had changed in a way he could not control. Daniel Kang remained nearby, quietly observing. Unlike the others, Daniel was not impressed by Richard's reputation. He had spent years around powerful people and understood that titles could disappear, fortunes could rise and fall, but character always remained. Daniel knew that one moment of arrogance could reveal more about a person than years of carefully crafted public appearances. He looked toward Ava as she continued serving guests with professionalism and grace. There was no anger in her expression, only a quiet strength that showed she refused to let someone else's disrespect define her. That was what caught Daniel's attention most. Not her position. Not what others assumed about her. But the way she carried herself when nobody expected her to have power. Meanwhile, Richard continued laughing with his guests, unaware that the person he dismissed was the one person in the room who had earned Daniel's deepest respect. He believed the evening would end with everyone remembering his success. He did not realize that people often remember something else entirely. They remember the moment someone with power reveals who they truly are. And Richard Whitmore had just revealed more than he ever intended. The atmosphere inside the Whitmore house remained elegant on the surface, but something had changed. The laughter around Richard Whitmore's table continued. The crystal glasses reflected the warm lights above, and the quiet music filled the space between conversations. Yet beneath that polished image, a moment of tension was growing. Ava Mitchell returned to her duties, carrying herself with the same professionalism she had shown from the beginning of the evening. She placed plates on tables, answered questions from guests, and continued serving with patience. But those who looked closely could see something different in her eyes. Not fear. Not anger. Something deeper. The quiet disappointment of someone who had once again been reminded that some people chose to judge before they ever tried to understand. For Ava, the hardest part was never a rude comment or an unfair assumption. The hardest part was seeing how easily some people forgot that every person standing in front of them had a story. She remembered the advice her grandmother gave her years ago. Never let someone else's lack of kindness change the person you worked so hard to become. Those words stayed with her through every difficult moment. They reminded her that dignity was not something someone else could take away. At Richard's table, however, the situation continued to grow. Richard noticed that Ava had not reacted the way he expected. He was used to people becoming uncomfortable around him, used to employees rushing to please him, used to seeing hesitation in the faces of those who depended on his approval. But Ava had simply remained calm. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Some people do not understand their place anymore, Richard said casually to his guests, believing his opinion carried more weight simply because of his success. A few people at the table forced polite smiles, but the reaction was not the same as before. The confidence in the room had shifted. Nearby guests had noticed the interaction. Some looked away, unsure whether to speak. Others watched quietly, sensing that something about the moment felt wrong. The restaurant had become a place where everyone suddenly understood that silence could say a lot. Daniel Kang observed everything from a distance. He noticed the hesitation of the people around Richard. He noticed the way Ava continued moving forward without allowing the situation to define her. And he understood something important. The problem was never just one person's words. It was the belief behind them. The belief that money, status, or reputation could decide who deserved respect. Daniel had seen that belief many times before. He had watched powerful people build walls around themselves until they forgot that every person deserved to be treated with basic humanity. But Ava was different. She did not need to announce her value. She did not need to prove she belonged. She already knew. As the evening continued, Richard remained unaware of the attention shifting around him. He believed he was still controlling the room. He believed his name was still the most powerful thing inside those walls. But Daniel knew the truth. Real power was not found in how many people followed you. Real power was found in how you treated those who could do nothing for you in return. And that night, Richard Whitmore had shown everyone exactly who he was. The only question left was how long it would take before he realized that the person he underestimated was standing at the center of a story he could no longer control. The evening at the Whitmore house had reached a moment where every person in the room seemed to sense that something unseen was about to change. The guests continued their conversations, the soft music continued playing, and the city lights outside the tall windows of the restaurant continued glowing over Manhattan. But inside, a quiet shift had already begun. Ava Mitchell carried another tray across the dining room, unaware that someone had been watching her. Not with judgment, but with respect. Daniel King had spent years learning how people revealed their true character when they believed nobody important was paying attention. He knew that some people used kindness only when it benefited them. He knew that some people confused influence with superiority. And he knew that the most revealing moments often happened when someone thought they had complete control. Daniel had arrived at the Whitmore house that evening expecting a simple dinner. He had planned to meet a few business contacts and leave before the night became complicated. But the moment he heard Richard Whitmore's words, his attention changed. It was not because Richard had insulted someone. Daniel had heard arrogant people speak carelessly many times before. What caught his attention was the confidence behind those words. Richard was not simply making a mistake. He truly believed that someone like Ava could be treated as less important. That belief was something Daniel could not ignore. As Ava walked past Daniel's table, he gently called her name. She stopped and looked surprised. "Ava," he said calmly. "Are you okay?" For a moment, Ava looked uncertain. She was not used to someone noticing the person behind the uniform. She gave a small smile and nodded. "I am fine. Thank you." But Daniel noticed what others missed. He noticed that her answer came from strength, not from pretending nothing happened. He knew that some people carried difficult moments quietly because they refused to let those moments control them. Richard noticed Daniel speaking with Ava and looked over with curiosity. At first, he did not recognize him. To Richard, Daniel appeared to be just another guest in an expensive restaurant. Another person who would eventually understand that Richard Whitmore was someone important. But then one of Richard's business partners leaned closer and whispered something. The confident expression on Richard's face slowly changed. Daniel Kong was not a stranger. His name carried influence far beyond the walls of that restaurant. He was known as a successful entrepreneur with connections throughout international business communities. More importantly, he was known as someone who valued loyalty and respect above appearances. Richard suddenly realized that the person standing near Ava was not someone he could easily dismiss. But Daniel did not use his reputation to embarrass Richard. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. True confidence did not require a performance. He simply looked at Ava and asked if she needed anything else before returning his attention to the situation. That simple act spoke louder than any display of power. It showed everyone in the room that respect was a choice. Richard remained silent for a moment, trying to understand why the atmosphere had changed. For the first time that evening, he felt something unfamiliar. Not fear. Not anger. Uncertainty. Because the woman he had ignored was no longer standing alone. And the man beside her was someone who understood exactly what had happened. Daniel looked across the room at Richard, and with a calm expression, he said, "Sometimes people reveal themselves without realizing they are being watched." The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Richard had spent years believing his position protected him from consequences. But now, for the first time, he wondered if the person he underestimated was connected to a world far beyond his imagination. And as the night continued, everyone in that restaurant began to understand that the balance of power had quietly changed. The silence that followed Daniel King's words lasted only a few seconds, but inside the Whitmore house, it felt much longer. Richard Whitmore looked across the room, trying to understand why a simple conversation had suddenly changed the atmosphere around him. For years, Richard had been surrounded by people who carefully chose their words around him. Employees smiled when he entered a room. Business partners agreed with his decisions. Guests at exclusive events often treated his presence as something important. He had become accustomed to being the person everyone noticed. But now, standing across from Daniel, Richard felt something different. He was no longer the only person with influence in the room. Daniel did not need to announce his reputation. He did not need to explain his achievements. His calm confidence spoke for itself. Ava watched the interaction quietly from a few steps away. She still did not fully understand who Daniel was to everyone else, but she understood the kind of person he was. He had not approached her with arrogance. He had not treated her like someone who needed to be rescued. He simply recognized that she deserved respect. That difference mattered. Throughout her life, Ava had met many people who wanted to speak for others without ever listening to them. Daniel was different. He listened first. Richard, however, struggled to accept the shift happening around him. He looked at Daniel carefully, searching for a reason why this man seemed so confident. Then one of his guests quietly explained what he knew. Daniel Kong was not just another successful businessman. He was the founder of a growing international company with strong ties throughout the United States and South Korea. His reputation had been built on discipline, loyalty, and careful decisions. People respected him because he did not chase attention. He earned trust through actions. Richard leaned back in his chair, processing the information. The woman he had dismissed as only a waitress was connected to someone with a level of influence he had not expected. But what surprised him most was not Daniel's background. It was the way Daniel treated Ava. There was no arrogance. No need to prove anything. Just genuine respect. That was something Richard rarely showed to people he considered beneath him. Daniel walked back toward Ava and spoke quietly. You should never have to apologize for expecting basic respect. Ava looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Those simple words meant more than he realized. Because for years, she had learned to handle difficult situations alone. She had learned to keep moving forward even when people judged her unfairly. But hearing someone acknowledge what happened reminded her that strength did not always mean standing alone. Sometimes strength was allowing others to stand beside you while you remained true to yourself. Across the room, Richard noticed something he had ignored all evening. People were no longer focused on his wealth, his business deals, or his reputation. They were watching a different kind of power. The power of someone who remained calm when challenged. The power of someone who protected dignity without demanding recognition. Richard had always believed that money created respect. But Daniel was showing everyone that respect was something earned through character. The evening was far from over. Richard still believed he could control the situation, but the truth had already started moving beyond his reach. The person he had underestimated was no longer invisible. And the man who heard every word was about to reveal that real influence was never measured by what someone owned. It was measured by what someone stood for. The restaurant that once seemed to revolve around Richard Whitmore was now filled with a different kind of attention. The guests were no longer focused on his expensive watch, his business achievements, or the confidence he carried into every conversation. They were watching a quiet moment unfold between people who represented two completely different ideas of power. Richard noticed the change, and for the first time that evening, he felt the room was no longer moving according to his expectations. He tried to return to his usual confidence, continuing his conversation with his business partners as if nothing had happened. He spoke about upcoming investments, new developments, and future plans worth millions of dollars. But the energy around his table was different. His guests listened, yet their reactions were not the same. They had witnessed something that money could not easily erase. They had seen the difference between having authority and having respect. Meanwhile, Ava Mitchell continued working through the evening. She did not allow the attention surrounding her to distract her from who she was. She carried herself with the same professionalism she had shown before. She greeted customers, checked on tables, and helped her coworkers whenever needed. But now, people saw her differently. The same guests who had barely noticed her before were beginning to recognize the strength behind her calm expression. They realized that the person they had overlooked all night was someone with incredible patience and confidence. Daniel Kang remained nearby, quietly observing the situation. He understood that moments like this were not about proving who had more power. They were about revealing the truth that was already there. Richard had believed that Ava's position in the restaurant reflected her value as a person. Daniel knew that was never true. A person's job, background, or appearance could never determine their worth. As the night moved forward, Richard's business partners began asking questions. They wanted to know more about Daniel and his connection to Ava. Richard tried to dismiss the situation, but his confidence was no longer convincing. The people around him had started noticing the details he ignored. They noticed how Ava treated everyone with kindness, while Richard treated people differently depending on their status. They noticed how Daniel carried influence without needing to display it. Most importantly, they noticed that the person who appeared powerful at the beginning of the night was not necessarily the person who represented true strength. Richard eventually approached Daniel, attempting to regain control of the conversation. He spoke carefully, trying to understand the situation without admitting that his own actions had created it. Daniel listened calmly. He did not insult Richard. He did not try to embarrass him. Instead, he simply said, "The way someone treats people who cannot offer them anything in return tells the world who they really are." Those words stayed with Richard longer than he expected. Because deep down, he knew the problem was never the misunderstanding at the table. The problem was the belief that allowed him to think his success gave him permission to disrespect someone else. For the first time in a long time, Richard Whitmore had no easy answer. His wealth could influence decisions. His reputation could open doors. But neither could change what everyone in that room had already seen. A person's true character was revealed in the moments when they believed nobody was watching. And that night, everyone was watching. The night continued inside the Whitmore house, but the atmosphere had completely changed. What had started as another evening where Richard Whitmore expected admiration had become a moment of reflection that he never planned for. The restaurant was still filled with elegant conversations and the warm glow of the city outside, but Richard no longer felt like the center of attention. Instead, he felt the weight of every silent observation around him. For the first time in years, people were not looking at his success. They were looking at his actions. Daniel Kong understood that true justice did not come from humiliating someone in return. It came from allowing the truth to be seen clearly. That was why he remained calm. He knew that Richard's greatest mistake was not one careless sentence. It was the mindset behind it. The belief that a person's position determined their value. The belief that some people deserved respect while others had to earn the right to receive it. Ava Mitchell had experienced that kind of judgment before. She knew that changing someone's opinion was not always possible. Some people refused to see beyond their own assumptions. But she also knew something more important. She knew that she did not need approval from people who refused to understand her. As she finished her responsibilities for the evening, Ava prepared to leave the restaurant. She expected the night to end quietly, just like many difficult moments before it. But before she walked away, Daniel approached her once again. "You handled yourself with incredible strength tonight," he said. Ava looked at him and smiled softly. "I just did what I always do. I stayed true to myself." Daniel respected that answer. Because he knew Ava was not searching for revenge. She was not waiting for someone else to prove her value. She already knew it. Meanwhile, Richard remained at his table, surrounded by the same luxury he had always enjoyed. But something felt different. His business partners were quieter. The confidence that usually surrounded him had disappeared. One of them finally spoke honestly. "Richard, you cannot treat people that way and expect everyone to ignore it." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a truth Richard had avoided for years. He had built an empire by understanding numbers, contracts, and negotiations. But he had failed to understand something much more important. People remembered how they were treated. The following days brought changes Richard never expected. Conversations from that evening reached people beyond the restaurant. Employees who had witnessed similar moments throughout the years began sharing their experiences. Business associates who once admired his success started questioning the values behind it. The image Richard had carefully built began to change, Not because someone attacked him, but because people finally saw the difference between appearance and reality. Daniel never needed to destroy Richard's reputation. He simply allowed the truth to stand on its own. That was the strongest lesson of all. A person could spend years creating an image of importance, but one moment of disrespect could reveal what was hidden beneath it. Ava returned to her normal routine, but she was no longer invisible. The people around her saw her differently. They saw her kindness, her patience, and her strength. She had never needed a title or a fortune to prove she mattered. She had carried her value with her all along. And Richard Whitmore finally learned the lesson he had avoided for too long. Money could create influence. Success could create recognition. But character was the one thing that determined how a person would truly be remembered. Several weeks had passed since the night that changed everything inside the Whitmore house, but the lesson from that evening continued to travel far beyond the walls of the restaurant. For Ava Mitchell, life returned to its familiar rhythm. She still arrived before her shifts began, still greeted every guest with kindness, and still carried herself with the same quiet confidence she had always possessed. The difference was that people now saw what had been there all along. They saw a woman who was more than a uniform, more than a position, more than the assumptions others had placed on her. Ava never needed the world to suddenly celebrate her. She only wanted to be recognized as a person, deserving of the same respect as anyone else. Daniel Kong remained a steady presence in her life. He admired Ava not because of what others discovered about her, but because of what he had noticed from the beginning. Her strength was never about proving she was better than anyone else. It was about refusing to let unfair treatment change the kindness she carried inside. One evening, Daniel and Ava returned to the Whitmore house for dinner. This time, Ava was not walking between tables carrying plates. She was sitting comfortably, enjoying a quiet moment after so many years of putting everyone else first. She looked around the restaurant and remembered the night when everything felt different. The same lights hung from the ceiling. The same city moved outside the windows. The same tables filled the room. But Ava was no longer standing in the same place emotionally. She had learned that being underestimated did not mean being powerless. Across town, Richard Whitmore faced a reality he could no longer ignore. His business world had changed. The people around him were more careful about the decisions they made. The conversations about his leadership style had become more honest. For the first time, Richard was forced to look beyond his wealth and achievements and examine the person he had become. He thought about that evening and the way Ava remained calm when he expected her to feel small. He thought about Daniel's words and the simple truth behind them. A person's character was revealed by how they treated people who could not offer them anything in return. Richard had spent years measuring success through numbers, properties, and influence. But now he understood that none of those things could replace respect. The world did not remember people only because of what they owned. It remembered them because of how they made others feel. Months later, Ava continued pursuing her dreams. She began exploring opportunities beyond the restaurant, using her experiences to inspire others who had ever felt overlooked. She spoke about confidence, patience, and the importance of believing in yourself even when others refused to see your value. Daniel supported her every step of the way, not as someone trying to change her story, but as someone honored to walk beside her. And in the end, the greatest change was not that Richard lost influence or that Ava gained recognition. The greatest change was that the truth became impossible to ignore. A person who was dismissed became the person everyone respected. A person who believed money defined importance learned that character mattered more. Because sometimes the strongest response is not anger. Sometimes the greatest victory is standing with dignity while the world finally sees what was always there. He thought she was invisible. But he never realized that true worth does not need permission to shine.